Hello there. I'm a casual 25-year-old Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh player with an intellectual interest in the design, aesthetics, gameplay, and economics of these two games. I also enjoy limited collecting as well as deck building and connecting with others on these topics. Today, I want to discuss how best to improve Magic the Gathering's economic model, as it's the oldest and most expensive TCG that exemplifies many of the issues found in all trading card game economies. First, some background. As most players are aware, there are three TCGs that reign supreme today, just as they have for the past 20 to 30 years: Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Pokemon. All of these were created about 30 years ago, 1993, 1996, and 1996 respectively, and as a result, all three of these games appeal to audiences of the same general age range, generally in the young adult age range. Uncoincidentally, their economic and design models are all very similar. There are threads of both truth and fallacy laced in their universal label, children's card games. While the themes we find in these three TCGs, such as high fantasy, anime tropes, and more, are often found in books and media that are traditionally intended for children and teenagers, the average age of those playing the games and the necessary money to invest in the games are both higher than one might expect, and only increasing. Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both have a ton of great attributes. Their artwork is stunning and virtually never misses the mark. Both game designs are strong and sustainable. The depth and breadth of both realistic and fantastic archetypes are broad. The social interaction a trading card game can provide is especially positive for a player base that tends to be more introverted. The base design of both games has also allowed for over 20 years of new archetypes and mechanics. And older cards from the dawn of both games still maintain value today, encouraging a staunch, established player base. These classic trading card games also have a lot of things going for them inherently. Because of the legacy and age of these trading card games, they not only have large audiences, but their consumer base also has invested time, energy, and hundreds or even thousands of dollars into the game, making them unlikely to leave. The rich history of art and lore developed over 30 years makes it difficult for a new TCG to break in without a previously existing IP to support it, like One Piece or Lorcana. And even then, the lack of card quantity in a new TCG makes the gameplay inherently handicapped in terms of depth and legacy when compared to the well-established ones. If that wasn't enough, the pandemic also gave an additional boost to older TCGs, as the acquisition of childhood memories and nostalgia proved to be a popular pastime for old, new, and existing players. However, TCGs are complicated. Inside each TCG is a core tension between two distinct forces: the rare, inaccessible collectability and the competitive and casual gameplay. Perhaps this was inevitable from the conception of the game. I'm sure Richard Garfield and the game designers from 30 years ago, all the way up until today, just wanted the best, most enjoyable game possible. But the executives and investors quickly realized that tapping into the collectability and economy of the game would be more profitable than just using the raw gameplay. Today, these two forces are still interlocked. On one hand, you have the very capitalistic, rational system composed of the haves and the have-nots, wherein those with money can acquire exactly what they want, and those without cannot. And those who entered early on have more, and those entering now find it much more difficult. And this feeds directly into the collectible nature of TCGs. In order for something to be worth collecting, the game must inherently have those who possess that thing and those who don't. And the only consistent restriction to establish who or who shouldn't do that is money. While my description might be a little bit harsh, I'm not dismissing its viability or necessity for keeping customers engaged and desiring more, so that there's always a next step to evolve your collection, as well as being the primary source of income for the producer of the product. On the other hand, you have the core gameplay, in which the rules, mechanics, and archetypes unite to form an enjoyable gaming experience. For this to be the most satisfactory, we want high accessibility in order to foster the largest, most diverse community possible. However, this doesn't in of itself make a ton of money, and needs the collectability to back it financially. Just like how first-class plane tickets being so expensive allow for the others to be cheaper, so too do the heavier spenders purchase a lot of product, enabling casual players to acquire the less valuable cards for cheaper, typically on the secondary market. At the same time, collectability can be difficult or too expensive to enter right off the bat, so the gateway drug of gameplay and casual play of today is essential for introducing tomorrow's collectors. Not to mention that if there are no casual players, then collecting something that few others have becomes a lot more difficult when the majority of your player base is no longer there. So, these two sides need each other and feed into each other, while at the same time desiring very different things. One wants high prices, whereas one wants low. One wants high accessibility, whereas one wants limited. There needs to be a proper distance and separation between the two, kind of like the moon orbiting the Earth. Too close and the moon will hurtle into the Earth, causing all life to cease to exist. Too far and the moon will fling into outer space, creating environmental disaster. Right now, however, I believe both parties are improperly served. It's as if half the moon is flying into the Earth, while the other half is hurtling into outer space. Today, there are disturbing trends throughout Magic the Gathering. Products continue to rise in price, while simultaneously being released at a faster and faster pace, making it inaccessible to new players. The TCGs, once marketed to all demographics, especially kids and teenagers, are more and more outside their price range, meaning that the TCG today is evolving to a strange sort of predatory luxury product in disguise as the wholesome social game. Simultaneously, the constant flow and reprinting of product has made it extraordinarily difficult for stores to survive, as evidenced by Troll & Toad, a large online TCG retailer, stopping selling Magic the Gathering altogether while continuing to sell all other TCGs. The mere existence of proxies should indicate that the game is inarguably inaccessible to most players, and that Wizards of the Coast is leaving money on the table. Even in Yu-Gi-Oh!, whose pricing is still disgusting and predatory, proxies are pretty much non-existent. All types of players, from new players wanting accessibility to collectors wanting sustainability, are being hurt by these decisions. Now, I'm not claiming that I know a better way to make profits for the next quarter than the executives running these companies, but what I am suggesting is that the current path is not sustainable, that the games are taking downward trends gameplay-wise because of these decisions, and that by illustrating potential changes, others might see a different path forward if not for these games, but for another TCG in the future. Trading card games are fantastic games that have many appealing and positive qualities, but because of clashing conflicts between consumers combined with corporate greed, companies inadequately serve each distinct customer type in order to maximize short-term profits. Throughout this video, I will try to take as balanced a perspective as possible despite my inherent biases. It's my goal to empathize with the producers in each type of consumer and come to a conclusion based on optimizing for all parties. I will first explore the diversity of the consumer as well as what the producer wants, and then propose methods that will give greater accessibility to the gameplay-focused players, while also establishing greater collectability for acquisition-focused players, allowing a smoother on-ramp for customers as opposed to Wizards of the Coast's current rich-size-fits-all business model. Let's start by better defining customers and the consumers in order to better understand their desires and motivations. So what do the consumers want? Well, trading card games are composed of many types of players, in which a player is defined as any person interested in acquiring cards from said TCG. I've divided them into 4 basic types that naturally can hybridize. In addition, it's important to note that while players want everything, they tend to prioritize and need specific things above others. First, collectors. They're players that don't necessarily play the card game itself, but enjoy possessing and acquiring cards, typically of rare or specific qualities. Not only is this often an expensive hobby, but it also inherently must be so, since the joy of collecting is derivative from obtaining things that are difficult to possess and that others do not have. Collectors often have a specific desire for artworks, rarities, archetypes, even defects, but most importantly want things that are hard to possess. They need to be able to collect scarce items that others want and that have long-term viability, not just rare and scarce now, but rare and scarce 10 years from now. Collectors do not care about the balance or rules or meta of the base game outside of the demand that it creates, which may make those kind of cards that are competitively viable more desirable to collect, since the other kinds of players also want to acquire them. Collectors often claim their collection is an investment, while in reality they derive the majority of their joy from collecting and possessing the cards rather than dealing them to the secondary market. That leads us nicely into investors, players who treat the card game like the stock market. Their goal revolves around financial gain and asset acquisition. Buy low, sell high, and hopefully hold a long time for long-term profit. While this generally requires a significant amount of upfront capital and/or early entry to do this seriously, if you are good at it, you should be in theory making money over time, though you will often carry a significant bulk of your investment as inventory, thus reflecting the base capital required. Investing successfully is often very time-consuming, and a successful investor needs to observe all facets of the game and player base, as the trajectory of card prices is reliant on all players' demand. In addition, there's a bit of early bird gets the worm, just like in collecting, in which the absolute oldest investments often prove to be the most profitable, just like the oldest collections tend to be the most valuable, while also being the most risky to invest in at that time. Investors need to be able to make money long-term from the game. While I don't generally like the idea of people trying to make money off an inherently trivial, fun, casual activity like a TCG, investors have a huge positive role in making cards available to every single player, and through internal competition, make for the lowest prices possible on single cards. Competitive players' main goal is to win the game. They view the cards as mechanisms through which they optimize their strategies and emerge victorious. A large portion of Yu-Gi-Oh's player base, compared to Magic the Gathering, is competitive in nature due to the base gameplay. The competitive scene in the TCG is much like a very early version of traditional sports, with groups of enthusiastic people coming together to compete for generally mediocre prizes. Competitive players seek cards that will provide the maximum chance to win, and thus are only interested in la creme de la creme of card potency. They care tremendously about the release of rules, cards, etc. from the perspective of, will this help or hurt my chances of winning? They also care about price, but only from the perspective of, how can I get the most potent cards at the lowest possible price? However, they also care about how fun it is to play and win with and against those best cards, because, after all, they're not playing for their financial livelihood in 99% of cases. They need to be able to compete with all available tools and have a chance to win in a fair environment that is repeatable and enjoyable. While it can seem silly for a frivolous game to be inherently played with the sole goal of winning or losing, min-maxing, theory crafting, deck building, and other components of competitive play are the competitive player's most enjoyable and engaging way of playing, which are perfectly legitimate reasons. The last category are the casual players. Casual players don't have nearly as definable goals as the previous three categories, but I would sum it up as they desire fun in every aspect of gameplay outside of just winning or profit. Unlike the previous three types, they can break net zero in terms of player enjoyment as a community by having both themselves and their opponent enjoy themselves instead of just one or the other. Competitive players base their enjoyment off of winning, and for every winner, there must be a loser. Collectors want to collect, and thus someone else must not have that thing for it to be worth collecting. Investors must make profit, and thus someone else must experience losses. And all of these reflect the net zero nature of them. Casual players will sacrifice card value, power level, or rarity if that will serve a more immersive or enjoyable experience. Casual players often have their own goal when playing the game, from trying to enact an aesthetic vision of what their deck should be, to being the arch-villain, to making sure the matchup is as even and fun for all involved as it can be. There's often a social component in the gameplay. In addition, casual players often engage with the game outside of its standard boundaries via toys, TV shows, movies, etc. It's worth noting that casual players are by far the largest constituent of a TCG community, while simultaneously being the lowest individual spenders. Casual players might have an interest in collecting, but due to its inherently high monetary barrier to entry, they will often not enter right away through this portal. Casual players need accessibility so that they, their friends, and content around them can be as enjoyable and accessible as possible. It's also crucially important to note that most players start as casual players, but can eventually take on the attributes of the other three players, meaning that making the game accessible to the casual player initially is extremely important. Those casual players might have liked the game as a kid, teenager, etc., but once they have a solid income and financial freedom, they could want to invest more heavily in the game later on. However, if they never had the opportunity to enter, engage, and play the game in a meaningful way, they're not going to have that connection, and never going to have a chance to become a big spender. Of course, most players, moreover, are some combination of all four. Post Malone, the musician and enthusiastic Magic the Gathering player, is some parts collector and casual player. Many Yu-Gi-Oh players are competitive and investors. I myself am probably about 70% casual, 25% competitive, and 5% collector. I love playing distinct archetypes that grant immersion, and I'm not averse to a shiny card or two. However, as you can tell from my Yu-Gi-Oh deck guides, I also enjoy the challenge of deck building and problem solving, not just for maximum competitive advantage, but also balancing that with immersion and overall enjoyment. Despite my description of 4 different players, I believe that they can be roughly grouped into 2 distinct parties, in which you have competitive and casual players in one, and investors and collectors in another. The first group of the competitive and casual players wants a low barrier to entry, accessibility, local game store access, and strong gameplay elements. The second group wants long-term monetary viability, local game store profitability, and a real accruing of value. While these traits don't inherently contradict each other, they very quickly come to disagreements with how to implement the economic model of the game. Wizards of the Coast has to tread a very thin line in order to appeal to both parties, but unfortunately right now, their methods are ineffective for both. At this point, I also want to address a core assumption that I make that others might disagree with. I assume that the casual player would want accessibility to gameplay as opposed to alternate artwork or aesthetic immersion. So we can't have easy accessibility to both. If we do, the whole idea of collectability goes out the window, which is still, as I have and will repeatedly say despite my lack of interest, mostly, is an essential quality for a trading card game. So I prioritize accessibility to gameplay mechanics over accessibility to aesthetic augmentations for several reasons. First, losing in a game because your opponent has more powerful cards than you is, in my opinion, far more frustrating than seeing an opponent with more shiny cards than you. On the contrary, I find seeing someone with shiny cards kind of cool, like they really showed that they put their earnings into their deck, whereas having someone win for reasons outside of the actual gameplay decisions often makes one want to quit. Secondly, it's traditionally true in life that there are a continuum of prices from very cheap to as expensive as you want. A $10 watch does virtually the same thing as a Rolex functionally, but the Rolex grants other optional perks. One could argue that because Magic the Gathering is in of itself an optional luxury activity, this doesn't apply. But once again, I think Magic the Gathering is more like the watch itself. It can be expensive and aesthetically customizable, thus becoming very expensive, but it could also be competitively cheap, allowing you to functionally do the same thing as your opponent for the same price. Third, the use of money can replicate the aesthetics of something, whereas it can't fully replicate gameplay. Give me enough money, and I can buy virtually every Magic the Gathering card, and have a greater collection than anyone alive. Heck, I can even buy Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro. However, no matter how much money or how many cards you have, the more experienced, skilled player will most likely perform better than a new player. Thus, allowing a player to acquire all the gameplay advantages possible will still leave the better player with an advantage, meaning that making gameplay more focused on skill and time invested is more satisfactory than relying on your budget to determine the winner. Fourth, games are extremely difficult to balance in a fun, sustainable, and fair way. To do it at all is difficult, nigh impossible, but if it is to be done to its maximum, it can usually only be done with one pool of cards. That, as one would expect, encompasses the entire pool of cards available in a particular mode. Say, Modern or Standard. Thus, the most satisfactory game experience should be using all the cards curated for a game mode without being restricted by financial reasons. Playing 2 precons against each other is okay, and should be balanced, and is very easily balanced, but it cuts out the entire principle of deck customization and improvement that is essential to a TCG. Pauper is a great mode, but what if, and hear me out, you didn't even need Pauper because everything was Pauper, and the developers were actually balancing to the general game mode. If you want a slower game mode, then just create a certain either ban list or timing restriction of cards you can play with. One could view Pauper as a symptom of horrible monetization instead of the saving grace that it sometimes seemed to be. Lastly, both modern and traditional models of games usually withhold aesthetics and grant gameplay up front. Examples range across many types of games, from League of Legends to chess, even to soccer. Therefore, we will assume when I say accessibility, I'm referring to accessibility of gameplay, and thus conversely, the inaccessibility and collectability will come via aesthetics. So what do the producers want? Well, when Wizards of the Coast is trying to create products, their number one concern is making the most amount of money possible. And that's it. Any art, gameplay, etc. is merely a method through which they can make profit. However, by trying to make as much money as possible, their long-term business practices are questionable at best. It is increasingly evident that Wizards of the Coast are ramping up their product output in an attempt to acquire as much short-term to mid-term profit as possible. There are a couple objective reasons for this. First, Hasbro's ownership of Wizards of the Coast, and thus control of Magic the Gathering, has taken an increasingly profit-driven stance. We can literally see this from their plans to grow profit from 2022. Hasbro's lucrative success with Magic the Gathering and lack of success with their other child companies recently has put more pressure on Wizards of the Coast to make as much short-term profit as possible. A comparable example is Blizzard using Hearthstone to eke out maximum profit. Second, the primary age range of Magic the Gathering players is currently in the ideal sweet spot for profit. It's no secret that some of the biggest spenders on casual activities are the young adult age bracket. Previously in life, they may have had the desire, but no income. Later on, they might have the income, but also have other responsibilities like a house mortgage or a family. However, young adults, specifically those locked inside during a pandemic, often have surplus income to spend on things like trading cards. And given when Magic the Gathering came out, these young adults, such as myself, are in the prime time for money extraction, not long-term product building. This is good for the company's bottom line, but not for the state of the game. Third, the increasing use of Universes Beyond is a compromise of Magic the Gathering's IP in exchange for a temporary influx of customers and income. Now, the benefits and drawbacks of Universes Beyond is a topic big enough for a whole nother video, but through the economic lens, we can view it as a definite short-term profit tool. Now we can see the evidence of short-term profit hunting through two objective facts. One, Wizards of the Coast are increasing product output by a significant amount, more so than over the past 20 years. Two, they are also increasing the price of products by a significant amount, even more so than over those past 20 years. So how do those actions increase short-term profit? Well, let's explore them one at a time. If Wizards of the Coast increase product output, some players might slow down their spending, but often players have a kind of methodology for purchasing that might actually speed up spending. For some, they purchase a certain amount of each product that comes out. If that's the case, then they would clearly spend more money the faster the product is released. For others, they purchase only if the product appeals to them. In that case, the products have a higher likelihood of appealing to different people, especially considering Universes Beyond, Secret Lairs, and all the very diverse and eccentric products coming out. So they too will most likely accelerate spending. So, in both these cases, the customer spends more. However, there is risk attached. For the collectors, collecting becomes harder and harder because of the sheer quantity of product, eventually making some people stop altogether. The investors risk a product crashing and not recouping their money, as well as losing their investment once reprints come for a previous product they invested in. The competitive player finds it more and more pricey to keep up in the game, and the casual can feel drowned and left out. We can umbrella all of these concerns under unique forms of burnout. The post-release hype building for a next set is an incredibly important time, not necessarily the most exciting, but incredibly important for the sustainability of the game, not just for the consumer to avoid burnout, but also for the producer to continue evolving and improving the game instead of making the same mistakes they may have made in previous sets. Therefore, we can see that increasing product output does improve short-term profits, but has long-term sustainability issues. But what about selling at higher prices, when in theory customers would buy less product at those higher prices? Shouldn't it all kind of even out? In reality, that's not always true. Let's examine Commander Masters, a recent Magic the Gathering release. It's a set full of reprints, so there is a secondary market estimate on how much an average box or pack or whatever of the set would cost. At this point, Wizards of the Coast decides what to price their product at. If they price it higher, their profit margins per unit sold will be higher, but less people will purchase it. Lower, the inverse will happen. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the profit margins are 100%. That's obviously not true, but let's assume for this hypothetical that that is true, and that it costs nothing to produce. And that if they priced their product at half the price, they would sell twice the product. If that's the case, would you, if you were Wizards of the Coast, sell the product at the higher price or the lower price? Well, seemingly these two situations result in the same outcome and are identical in terms of profit. There's a lot of theory written on this subject for all industries, but the highly regenerative secondary market omnipresent in TCGs is a unique feature that unfortunately favors selling it at a higher price point. The more supply there is, the less that the thing sells for on the secondary market. The less that the thing sells for on the secondary market, the lower the value of reprints in future products, and therefore the lower the estimated value of a product including those reprints in the future. Thus the initial pricing is lower and profit margins are lower. You're effectively killing equity. Now, in a practical example, if Wizards of the Coast chose to sell Commander Masters at a lower price, but made the same profit margins, then they would potentially make the same or more money now and reach more customers. But the Jewel Lotuses and other expensive chase cards from the set will cost far less on the secondary market because of the more people and cards now present there. Not only lessening the desire for people to buy the set going forward, but also the value of reprinted Jewel Lotuses in a future set, both of which are bad for Wizards of the Coast. Normally, when products have high demand, the price rises. However, TCGs have a strange rubber banding recycling effect due to the secondary market that selling a more spoilable product like food doesn't have. Once a product is sold, its entire value isn't consumed and can still be resold, meaning that, assuming the net profit margins remain even remotely the same the higher prices are, there's a ton of incentive for Wizards of the Coast to keep prices on the raw product high. So, unfortunately for the consumer, Wizards of the Coast is incentivized to keep prices high and thus sell to the highest spending demographic possible. This naturally results in keeping secondary market supply low so that the value of current and future products remains high. This is how we end up at $400 Commander Master set booster boxes. And this only gets worse as the players who can afford these products are the ones who are the most wealthy, meaning that the lower spending players stop playing, which means a higher percentage of the player base consists of the whales, which finally results in pricing and marketing that will be increasingly so for those players, and so on and so forth. The cycle continues. The player pool becomes more homogeneous, and suddenly you've lost most of the players that make up your community, as well as almost all new players, meaning that you have very little incoming new blood. So, just like with higher product output, raised prices also result in greater short to mid-term profit with decreased long-term viability. Well, now that we've established Wizards of the Coast is extracting maximum short-term profit, we can now explain their decisions to make Magic the Gathering increasingly expensive over the past 5 years. There are a ton of examples to choose from, but I'll discuss a few crucial ones. In 2019, two very important things happened. The first was the elimination of MSRP, which removes all accountability, or most accountability, from Wizards of the Coast in terms of market pricing. Normally, MSRP establishes a ceiling price for products on release, and also dictates, to some extent, the distribution prices being somewhat consistent with previous products. With MSRP, if a product is priced by community perception, generally compared to past products as too high, Wizards of the Coast would take the blame. But without it, there's kind of a smoke and mirrors effect as to Wizards of the Coast distribution costs, and instead the local game stores and other retailers take the flak for the pricing. A lack of MSRP removes the already very limited transparency in Wizards of the Coast pricing decisions, opening the door to the disgusting prices we see today. It puts the onus on the distributors and the local game stores to lower prices, while Wizards of the Coast sits in their ivory tower behind obscure distribution prices. Later that year, Wizards of the Coast announced Project Booster Fund. In theory, this design was intended to address the different players I described above. Collector boosters were for, well, collectors and investors. Set boosters were for the competitive players. Draft was for casual players. Problem solved? Not so much. In reality, these products were all crucially flawed in their own unique ways. First of all, the existence of so many products made local game stores and distributors have the extremely difficult task of projecting and purchasing the exact type of product their customer base would want. Any significant miscalculations could result in massive loss and swamps of unused inventory. The collector boosters were flawed, not in the sense that they were undesirable, but almost that they were released too much for the collectors who desired that limited access. The scarcity wasn't enough for many collectors and investors, meaning that it was difficult to keep value on these cards. In addition, reprints down the road would still erode the value of collector boosters, or the cards therein. Set boosters were still very expensive, look at Commander Masters, but were overall the most successful product due to their similarity to the older conventional boosters. And draft boosters, while they did their job, were still quite expensive and targeted the relatively small draft community. Also, ironically, the presence of products theoretically targeted to specific player types made it more confusing for new players and those specific player types due to the sheer quantity of product to choose from. So, while the intent might have been good, the execution was quite poor. In 2020, Wizards of the Coast began Universes Beyond, starting a snowball that would eventually culminate into the rapid release of Universes Beyond that we see today. Commander Precon decks have, in the past couple of years, shot up in price. Previously, they were $30, then over the course of 10 years bumped up to $40, and recently, with the lack of MSRP, have gone up to $60, and even as high as $100 with the 2023 Eldrazi Precon. This aggressive pricing, which would have been either exposed or solved or something better with MSRP, indicates that Wizards of the Coast most likely also raised the distribution prices on the pack of 4 Commander Precons. Another, perhaps even more egregious example is Commander Masters, a set currently listed at $300 on the secondary market for a set booster box. Hilariously, this is actually a severe cut to the initial pricing of a staggering $400. As a product of Project Booster Fund, it's darkly humorous that this product is intended for the competitive and casual players, as set boosters are, and it's a set full of reprints, thus in theory designed for accessibility, and yet proposes one of the most predatory price points of all time. Not a luxury product, by the way. Note that Wizards of the Coast can use the distributors in local game stores as a human shield to take any losses, as they already sell the product at their jumped up price and the quantity, and the local game stores are the ones who can't sell it. Then Wizards of the Coast can use that valuable information to reevaluate their prices without paying for their mistake right away. And now we have play boosters, the incestual offspring of set boosters and draft boosters caused by Wizards of the Coast's own incompetence with Project Booster Fund. There are, of course, some benefits to them. They'll help eliminate logistical issues that Wizards of the Coast themselves caused with Project Booster Fund. They'll also streamline products for the consumers. However, these positives are trivial compared to the critical issues that this new product causes, and that still exist. Play boosters are going to be even more expensive than set boosters and draft boosters for each set on a card-by-card basis. The bar to entry is higher for new players in terms of investment. I would argue that there's still no excellent product for players with less capital. And this does little for the collector besides for creating a cute little antique in terms of draft boosters. Not to mention that these sets are being released every month or so, meaning that to be able to consume each of these sets in any form, whether casual, competitive, or collecting, the game demands thousands of dollars a year. An absurd price tag considering that a premium video game is $70 or an HBO Max subscription is $150 a year. I'm sure that Wizards of the Coast would love for every player to be spending hundreds of dollars a month on Magic the Gathering, but that's simply not realistic or in line with the other entertainment options available, even amongst TCGs for the majority of people. Though this might mean this product is not for you, TCG should be desiring consistent customer interaction, not deterring customers from it. And to make matters worse, Magic the Gathering's standard game mode and increasing levels of power creep make it more and more important to invest in each product to keep up from a competitive or even just an immersive point of view. But wait, you're saying, you can't resell a video game on Steam or an HBO Max subscription, whereas you can resell those cards you purchased. However, I believe this way of thinking is inherently problematic for both the casual and competitive player, since unless you have an absurd amount of time to devote to the purely economical aspect of the game, knowing how and when to sell optimally, which shouldn't be necessary, you're going to lose the majority of the money you've invested, making your recoup pretty negligible. If you're a kid or teenager trying to sell their cards, they're unlikely to have the means to do it effectively, and it will be very difficult to make your money back. Not to mention that the upfront capital to get into the game in the first place is something some people just don't have at a young age. The competitive and casual players should not have such a high price of entry to play or compete. As much as possible, the player's skill and time expenditure engaging in the game should be sole factors responsible for solely winning or losing. Ideally, the price to compete or play should be, on a monthly basis on average, at a lowish consistent rate for the minimum acceptable involvement. The emphasis here is on consistent. And don't worry, there will still be many players, dare I say the majority of casual and competitive players, that bling their decks out with the more expensive version of cards, keeping Wizards of the Coast bottom line A-OK. It's just that the access point should be low. We can use the metaphor of playing in a soccer league for comparison. It costs the same for the first place team as it does for the last place team to enroll, from your star player to your newest recruit. There's a reason why soccer is the most popular sport on the planet. Yes, it's old, it has a storied history, and is uniquely positioned rules-wise, just like Magic the Gathering. But arguably, most importantly, it's accessible to virtually everyone. You only need a round object and a couple of sticks, and you can play basically the same game as the pros from age 1 to 100. There are, of course, options for expensive boots and balls, just like there are fancy foils. But Pele, a kid who grew up in poverty, played with a sock instead of a ball, and swapped his school shirt for a team shirt, became one of the greatest players of all time. Yes, playing in an academy or with an expensive league is going to help you develop a little faster, but the barrier to entry is very low. There isn't a player rocking a Yu-Gi-Oh! Starter deck he's practiced a million times that's won a YCS, and there never will be. I guarantee it. And yet, soccer has an immensely profitable model for all of the leagues, supply providers, players, and more who partake. What soccer critically does, to a large extent, that TCGs and Magic the Gathering especially do not, is correlate casual enjoyment and competitive success to a price tag. And that's what we need to remove. Now, at this point, some of you might be saying, well, this is all well and good, but why should Konami or Wizards of the Coast or any of these companies care? Their only responsibility is to their shareholders and to maximize profits. Everything and anything they can do to acquire money is and should be on the table. If they can brainwash the community into thinking that their current business practices are moral, they can and should be able to do it. Well, and this is partially correct. From a completely amoral standpoint, that is their job and their duty. The fantasy game is merely a vehicle by which they attach the syringes to the whales and minnows and siphon as much fat as possible before they swim away. But this, I believe, lets them off the hook too easily without examining the subtleties in the situation. First of all, let's not beat around the bush. They make a tremendous amount of money. A disgusting amount, really. Last year, Yu-Gi-Oh! Drove Konami's profit margins up 25%, while Wizards of the Coast made a staggering 40% profit margin. So these companies are not struggling financially right now and should be examining other potential issues in their player base, not scrambling to release their 10th set of the year for some extra dough. Secondly, the pricing is so bad that proxying has become a popular practice amongst playgroups, and a company should treat proxying as alarm bells that there is something seriously wrong with the accessibility of your game. Third, there are several approaches you can take to sell a product. And for this, I'll use the popular West Coast burger chain In-N-Out as my metaphorical example. For those who don't know, In-N-Out specializes in a very limited menu consisting solely of burgers, fries, and beverages, while boasting some of, if not the lowest prices available of all with premium fast food ingredients and excellent customer service, all while paying their employees above minimum wage and the general wage for fast food. So how do they do this? Well, they only have a 20% profit margin, their supply lines are always efficiently within reach of their restaurants, and they don't prioritize expansion. But most importantly, their restaurant is always busy and takes in a ton of customers due to their great customer service, low prices, and good quality ingredients. They choose an overall low profit on the individual unit, trusting the vast number of products that they can sell per restaurant will compensate for that. In-N-Out might not be the most delicious food ever, despite what people visiting California might think, nor cheaper than every other single option. But their combination of price and quality is undoubtedly one of the best. And importantly, they attract customers and consumers of all ages, from elderly customers who have loved their food for 70 years to teenagers who only have $5 to spend on a burger after school and might continue to eat there the rest of their life. Wizards of the Coast, on the other hand, does not take this approach. They typically price their products aimed at the collectors and the most entrenched competitive players fully on that addiction crack, leaving others in a very difficult spot. They attempt, and successfully do, make huge profit margins on their sales when they could make less per unit profit on more sales. And I'm not saying their business decisions are unwarranted. As we explored above, they are trying to make the most short-term money possible, and are doing so successfully. The only response the community can give is simply to not buy the products at those prices, which unfortunately hurts everyone, as cards will remain highly priced, Wizards of the Coast will make lower profit, but Wizards of the Coast will then have to release them at lower prices in the future so that they will actually make a good profit margin. However, this is unrealistic, as people, especially the investor type player, will buy the product as soon as they perceive potential profit. Capitalism's main response, from a theory point of view, to these kind of issues is to naturally produce a superior competitor, maybe another trading card game. But due to these TCGs, these three main TCGs, long reigns virtually unchallenged, and the investments of hundreds or thousands of dollars a player will have made into the game, you have this soft monopoly of sorts that's very hard to break. So, while there is a pure business justification for Wizards of the Coast practices, I believe they are neglecting long-term support for both the new and existing players. Currently, the barrier to entry is extremely high because of such logical business practices, and thus the player acquisition and retention is less than it could be. A casual player needn't always be a casual player. They might enter that way as a kid or a teenager, but once they grow older and have a job and find more friends to play with, they can increase their investment for their own personal pleasure. However, they aren't going to even enter if the initial investment required to play with the game with other people is so high. The goal is, instead of providing a high platform the new players have to jump onto and reach, and the old players must be satisfied with standing on, to create a ramp that enables new players easy access while providing them the capability in the future and desire for additional enjoyment and immersion via investment. Alright, so that's a lot of doom and gloom, but are there solutions to these problems? Well, I have a business model for card releases that could help bring new, oftentimes younger and interested players with a lower price tolerance into the game, while keeping collectability and a way to immerse oneself further in gameplay after the initial experience. What if the collectors and investors actually had things worth collecting that wouldn't lose value over time, making it both profitable long-term and valuable? What if the casual and competitive players had accessibility to every game mechanic? Is it too good to be true? Perhaps, but here's my best shot. Note that this model isn't something entirely revolutionary, but I hope that my description of customers' desires and producer necessities will lend more credence to its viability. So in my proposed model, every new card release should be released at a common or near common, like uncommon, rarity in a basic, normal artwork. On the other hand, a strict aesthetic improvement, or at least as close as you can get to it, to each card, or at least the most powerful or popular ones, should be released in a collectible rare form that would not be reprinted and would carry long-term value as the premium version of that card from the set. This would create an accessible, competitive environment that would enable the best players who would invest time into their decks to succeed, not just the biggest spenders, as well as give a desirable upgrade to any deck, enticing both casuals and collectors alike, but not necessary to either. I believe that the root of the problem is the top-down existence of rarity for every spending bracket, from the most casual to the collector with the largest pockets. A hallmark of trading cards is the idea of rarity, hailing back to baseball cards over a century ago. Rarity serves several purposes, from organizing draft modes in a slightly more predictable and functional way to, more importantly from a business perspective, allowing the company to limit access to the most desirable and competitively potent cards in a way that's considered immersive and acceptable by the majority of the player base, but creates huge supply and demand imbalances, leading to very high prices on the secondary market. Those cards should be released with the most basic art design. Every card should be, and should be reprinted in that version until the cheapest versions of any card is no higher than, say, $5. In addition, for immersion, cards that are resources like lands, Magic the Gathering, or utility spells like Pot of Prosperity and Yu-Gi-Oh! Should never exceed $2 in their cheapest form, whereas the boss monsters in those kind of games could canonically be a little higher, like Access Code Talker or your Commander, if it's absolutely necessary, making the acquisition of those cards much more satisfying. I'd still want all the cards available in their basic form at the same price, but doesn't it feel better to spend $10 on your Commander or main high-end monster, the centerpiece of your deck and poster child for your strategy, as opposed to 1 or even 4 of a random utility card, just so that you can justify to yourself that you're min-maxing optimally? Shouldn't rarity be intuitive, that a legendary creature would actually be a little more rare, and that a stupid underground sea would be readily accessible? I understand the economic reasons why those utility cards are more expensive, with with the demand being higher, but Wizards of the Coast should compensate for that. Much of our understanding and justification of rarity comes from deep inlaid impressions from content like the Yu-Gi-Oh! TV show, in which we always thought of ourselves as Kaiba or Yugi or even Joey. Well, guess what? We're not Kaiba because we aren't bajillionaires, well, except Post Malone. We aren't Yugi because we aren't cheaters and or lucky. We're not even Joey or Rex Raptor. We didn't even get to go on the ship to go to Duel Island. None of us are pharaohs, and conceptualizing and framing ourselves from the perspective of, ooh, the cards are super expensive and traditional rarity structures are awesome and that's justifiable because there were only 4 Blue Eyes White Dragons, is a trick that companies pull to brainwash you into thinking it's okay. This model would greatly support the casual and competitive players who want gameplay accessibility. It would enable more casual players, specifically those on a lower budget, to enter the game and buy the most powerful of decks for $50 to $200 to be able to play with all their friends and be on an even playing field, not $2,000, which in of itself is still a large sum, but at least much, much better. Competitive players could be anyone who has the talent, desire, and time in order to achieve competency, which oftentimes is kids, not just those with those qualities who also have a large wallet. In order to compensate for this change and to continue satisfying investors and collectors, both of whom would be greatly harmed if these were the only kinds of cards available, I believe that all foils, fancy alternate art, etc., basically anything outside the basic art that we discussed earlier, should be actually exclusive and thus would fetch a high price on the secondary market. They should have one distinct printing for an excellent artwork in a particular product and then not be reprinted in that art and rarity again. Alternate arts of the same card shouldn't devalue the existing awesome premium version, but instead appeal to a distinctly different demographic, kind of in the style of Universes Beyond or Secret Lairs, so that they have their own distinct value in people who want it. I think that the serialized 1-in-1 ring is an extreme but excellent example of this. These packs would still contain both the common playable versions and the exclusive very rare foils, but the idea would be that collectors and investors could open packs seeking value, whereas the competitive and casuals could purchase affordable cards on the secondary market. This would still offer the addiction-inducing gambling thrill we all know and love, while being firmly ensconced as a luxury investment, the pack opening that is. As I've already mentioned several times, investors don't care so long as certain products can make them a profit and their investments increase over time, which these foils would due to their scarcity and aesthetic desirability. In this model, you can make limited edition releases of certain arts and designs that will never be reprinted and thus represent great investments. These would also enable collectors to strive for difficult to acquire but desirable products, as these cards that you reprint would be the most powerful and interesting cards. You'd simply have an inexpensive common version backing it. That's the only difference from the current model. I think that there's also space for a more comprehensive accessibility product in which Wizards of the Coast would release, say, every card in the set for $100 in their common form. All of them together, one of them each in their common form. Imagine a world in which there was actually a product aimed at casual or competitive players, in which the secondary market wasn't necessarily the best option. Wow, what a concept. True, there are pre-con decks, but they're so limited in scope that they fail to accomplish what they're intended to do. And nowadays they're so expensive, it feels like you're almost buying the whole set anyways. The biggest strength of my model is that the natural onboarding for an incoming consumer would be much smoother. First, you might purchase a pre-con or other product priced fairly. Then, acquire the basic versions of cards for a strategy you find interesting. Next, if you enjoy those a lot, maybe invest in the really cool versions of them that's your favorite deck or strategy. If you don't, maybe trade those basic versions away and get something else, or if you want, just keep them for later. Lastly, you can create a collection or investment in existing luxury products, the fancy foils and distinct alternate arts, if that's something that interests you and you can afford. That collection would be initially expensive to purchase, but would have long-term viability. In this way, you'd have a beautiful blend of separating the two basic contrary demands in the game. One of which wants scarcity and long-term value, and the other of which wants accessibility and an even playing field, while combining and uniting them under the same engaging game. Oof, well, that was a lot of content. If you enjoyed the video, or have ideas or thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments. If you agree with the principle behind this video, please share it or the points I bring up so that Wizards of the Coast and other companies might be more pressured to adopt such a model. This video took a tremendous amount of time and effort to conceptualize and execute, so if you found anything about it interesting or engaging, please let me know, and I hope you have a great day.